The second step in the process after prayer is assessment. We have to do assessments. It's amazing how little we do assessments in the church today. And so when we're talking about assessments, first we're talking about assessing the church, right? Review, who are we? You know, what is the people gift mix within your congregation? Because everybody's revitalization is going to look different. Everybody's assessment is going to look different. It's the reason why you can pick up somebody's book. You can pick up a Warren or a Hybels or any other book on church growth. You can pick that up and you try to figure out, why didn't this work in my context? Well, that was for their context, not your context. So context is everything. You need to know, who do you have? You know, so the starting point for vision and for thinking about our church's future is not deciding where we want to go or exploring what is working for other churches, but understanding how we are unique. And that's from my buddy Will Mancini in Church Unique. That's a quote that he had. And so thinking about who you are, thinking about who has God assembled in that place, right? That plays a part in who you're called to reach. That plays a part in what kind of church you have. And so we can't just be a clone of someone else, because God has uniquely and wonderfully made each of his people, and he prepared us for a purpose. And so we have to understand who we are. So you have to try to discover your church's uniqueness. And Will Mancini throws some questions out there, and I add some to it. But question, what is God's unique thumbprint for your church, right? What is different about your church's corporate grace and collective soul? What does your church do better than 10,000 others? You know, what are unique strengths of your leaders? What does the collective gift mix look like? What kind of heritage do your people share? What shared experience do your people have in common? How does the denominational background or lack thereof have an impact on your uniqueness? What values drive decision-making in your church? What is the natural or prominent any style of evangelism employed by your church? What sins and sin patterns have your people been delivered from? So when you look at this list, you know, when we talk about the unique thumbprint of your church and your church's corporate grace and collective souls, it's saying, if you was to ask the people in your church, give a survey and ask what people group, if you had your choice to minister to any people group, which would it be and why? And you begin to hear who their hearts lead for, who their hearts bleed for. And so you may have a congregation that bleeds for single mothers or for fatherless boys or for seniors, you know. And when you ask those questions and know who they have a heart for, you realize that, wow, we've been doing a soup kitchen and that's not where they are. You know, we've been doing a literacy program and not saying it's not good, but that's not what we are called to do, because the people who we have are different. When you look at your people and you say, what do we do better than anybody else? You know, one thing that we do in my church is love. We try to love better than anybody else. You know, so what does that look like? That means when you walk in, you're going to get hugs. You're going to get love. And so we want to be, if you don't get a hug no other time during the week, you're going to get it here. If you don't get encouragement no other time, you're going to get it here. So what does it look like? Hospitality is great. Love is great. There's an outpouring and a demonstration of that in this context, so that when we go out, we know the one thing we can do well is love, right? And so that's the MO. And so out of that births everything else. And so when you figure out who you have, you know, when you figure out what's the strengths of our leaders? Well, we have a lot of educators, right? And so if you got a lot of educators, don't think it's by chance that you have a lot of educators. So you say, hey, look at the vocational, abilities and gift mix that you have here. We have a lot of educators. We probably should be doing something in education. You know, that's not a big leap there. And so when you begin to look at your church, you begin to survey your church, then you begin to realize, what are we actually called to do and how we are to do it, right? Also, you have to assess not just who are we, but where are we, right? Where are we? And what does that mean? I mean, folks, we got to deal with this refocusing. You know, are we at a place where we're stagnant inside? in size. It needs to have a clearer focus on evangelism and outreach. And so when we think about where are we, we have to be honest as a church. Let's assess where we are. Are we at a place where it's just a refocusing? And Ed Stetzer in Comeback Churches, he kind of breaks this down. And so he breaks down these stages, and we got to figure out where are we in that stage, so that we can have a sober assessment of ourselves and begin to plan moving forward. Are we at a re-energizing place? Which means that we're declining in size, and we need to deal with some internal issues to begin reaching our community again. All right, and so we could be, all right, look, we needed to refocus. We're becoming stagnant. We have to, maybe have a series on a vision again and have to kind of help just stir people and just get the fire moving again. That's one place. But then there's this re-energizing. So we're not stagnant now. We're actually declining, right? We're actually realizing that the 10% of the people that we just lose, by attrition, which is natural, we're not gaining the 10% anymore, right? So now we're declining, and now we got to deal with some things. Why is the back door becoming as open as the front door? What aren't we doing? And so we got to begin to recognize that many times we've gotten comfortable. Many times we stop coming up with ways and reasons to invite people. We become more internally focused. And so we got to focus on that re-energizing people and reminding them of the vision and the mission that God gave us. And then we have this restructuring. And Ed describes that as a church that has experienced substantial decline, and it needs large internal changes and a new outreach strategy. And so when we start talking about restructuring, then it goes back to that assessment. Sometimes we keep leaders in place because we see them as volunteers. And sometimes we put ceilings on everything we do because we keep the same people in place. And I believe that God has people in places for seasons, and sometimes you can lead this, and sometimes God can do things in you and you need to move to a different area. Sometimes we need to reevaluate our leaders and reevaluate how we're doing things. And so when you talk about this restructuring, this is saying that it's more than a vision thing. It's more than an energy thing. It's questioning, do we have the people in place to actually accomplish the mission that God has gave us, right? And so that's a tough one now, when we start talking about that part. And then we have what we call restarting. And that's when it's near death. And that can be a church with a long history and a long, wonderful history. But the decline, that's taking place is going to close the church if this current trend continues. And it needs to restart with leadership and an entirely new church. And so this restart idea is one that no one likes to hear about, but it's real. We're closing, and Southern Baptist alone, close to 1,000 churches, every year. And we're trying to start. I think we started 894 over the last year. So we're closing more than we're starting, right? Now, the problem with that, is one, is always painful to see churches close. Another one is many of our churches are starting, and they're starting from scratch. They're starting with no resources. They're starting with no people, and they're trying to make it out of those first 5 years to kind of be viable and self-sustaining. Now, the issue with a restart is we can have an older church who served the community well for 150 years, and they're holding on to the building, and they don't realize that they can be such a catalyst for the next generation in the next 100 years. And so restart doesn't have to be the end. It can be the start of a new beginning. And so that's another process. So assessing where you are, whether or not you're in the refocusing, re-energizing, restructuring, or restarting. These are those processes, and these are these stages that we have to assess. And now we're going to move on. So what do we do? Okay? So when we talk about first who we are, and then you talk about where we are. Now we're talking about in this assessment. So what do we do? And so we have to make a calendar and a financial assessment. So what I'm saying is we got to look at the things that we do over the course of a year, and we have to analyze that and see if it's driven by tradition versus vision and mission. You know, what are we spending our dollars on? What things were just for us, and what was for the other people outside of the church? And that assessment is important, because when I go into a church, and without pulling out assessments and documents and surveys and things, and the church tell me that, you know, Dr. Anderson, we're in decline, man. We need some help. We need you to do an evangelism training, man. I got to get my people out on these streets and this and that. And I want to come in and I want to talk about this assessment and how are things going. And you're saying, you know, how you want to see your church grow. I'll say, you know, let me see your calendar for this year. Let me see your calendar for last year. Show me what's different in the 2 years. Let me see your calendar from the year before. You know, many times we just add a number. We keep all of the same events. You know, now we have the 25th anniversary. We have the 32nd this and the 41st this and everything that we do. We just add a year on and make sure that the date line up the same third Saturday, and we do the same thing over and over and over again, as if we're expecting something different to happen. You know, when I go in and I look at your calendar, and your calendar looked like last year's calendar, and nobody got saved. The baptism, the baptistry has become a storage bin, you know, and look here, we have to do something different. There's no business in the world that stays alive doing the same thing and not producing the fruit that you've been called to produce. You know, we've been called to make disciples. We spend a whole lot of time building a church. If I'm not mistaken, I think God said he'd build a church, told us to make disciples, right? And so all of these things that we have on our calendar, we got to ask, what are those things that we have to do with making disciples? Did anybody get saved at the 35th annual? Why are we doing the 36th annual? To celebrate ourselves? You know, and again, I believe that there's room for celebration in the church. I'm not saying that anniversaries is bad for any of your auxiliaries and your ministries. I'm just saying sometimes we put a whole lot of energy and a whole lot of time, you know, and a whole lot of resources in events that have nothing to do with reaching the lost. It has nothing to do with discipling people, you know. And so the church itself become a business, and we become self-consumed in that business. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing? We have to go down our calendar and say, how many of these things that we did over the course of a year was really meant to reach somebody? How many of these things was designed for discipleship, you know? And then how many of these things was designed for us, just for our club, just for our church? So we have to assess what we do.